Yes, welcome. This is A RAP CRITIC. I'm your boy Malik 16, founder of Plates and Crates and the Rap Ruler. And no, I don't want your money or your life, but I do want your membership. And since I mentioned the Rap Ruler, it'd be a great time for you to go sign up, become a member so you can cast your votes, rank all the albums that we've covered so far, and forget what I said about it. Put your own scores and tallies up there. Become a part of this global hip hop community and determine for yourself how classic these classics are. And the classic today is no exception to the rule, because we're talking about one of the most pivotal albums in the discography of the rapper that we're talking about today. And so it's very special because not only is it the 25th anniversary of this album this year, but this is also marking a year where this rapper is going into retirement and currently on his farewell tour. We're talking about none other than Houston's own Scarface and his 1997 release, The Untouchable. Now, if you have not already, you might want to take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. All the new follows, all the membership is greatly appreciated. We are growing slowly but surely every video, and that's all because of y'all. Thank y'all for listening to me talk forever and ever in Babylon. I'm just trying to really give y'all a breakdown of these albums in a way that no one else is really doing. We're talking about category 1, where we're going over the album, the product itself. And the first dimension that we get into when we're talking about category 1 is dimension 1, the quality of the production. Now, this may be a fun fact only to half of the audience, because I think when it comes to Scarface, there's 50% of those who know and 50% of those who don't know that Scarface has pretty much always handled some element of the production since the beginning of his career, from Mind Playing Tricks on Me all the way to the last thing he recorded. And he's managed to assemble what has become kind of fabled as a Houston dream team with him and N.O. Joe and Tone Capone, as well as Mike Dean, who most of you might know from his work with Kanye West later on in the 2000s. And so on here, they are really testing the limits of their teamwork, and Scarface is at the helm. Scarface gets production credit on every song here except for the one that's at the end by Dr. Dre, and we'll talk about that more as we go on later in the album. But it's not the kind of production credit that's superficial, where it's like, oh, I told him to use this sample so I get production credit. Scarface was on the boards from the inception of these beats, if not carrying most of the groundwork himself. You get more piano hands-on involvement when you start talking about Mike Dean and Tone Capone. And we know that N.O. Joe, from our review of UGK's album, Riding Dirty, tends to favor this kind of funk groove element, and you'll hear that a lot because those things are present on here. We're hearing a lot of electro bass, more from like the funky kind of side of the spectrum. We're hearing wah-wah guitar. We're also hearing deep keys and deep organs, and something that I alluded to and kind of coined in our Twister Adrenaline Rush review, what I call wet keys. And I say that because I do not know the technical term, but these are like these pieces of instrumentation that create this kind of lingering ripple effect. And it's similar to if you stick your finger in a pond or something, right? So all my musicians and students of music who come across this or who follow the channel, please leave in the comments the proper names and if you can identify some of the instruments used on this album, because they're very distinct and they are part of cementing a Southern, but specifically Texas rap sound that was really prevalent and influential in the 90s. And Scarface and this team are responsible for kind of pioneering that. And so you'll hear things that show you just how deliberate they were using those instruments in so many different ways, that two things happen here. There's a familiarity, an overarching familiarity effect, because some of these instruments get used over and over, but in different ways, to the point where there's a comfort. It keeps it centered because you know that is the core sound of this album, but they go and play with different tones to the point where each song sounds different from each other, which is not an easy feat. To use the same kind of instrumentation but create different chambers, that's top level production there. So we'll hear how deliberate things are from the first song, which shares its musicality with the intro. The intro is just a slow build up to what eventually is the beat for the title track, Untouchable. And in that is this marriage of two elements that kind of define Scarface, right? It's the idea that, you know, his whole persona is influenced by gangster movies, and this is a beat that is the closest you're going to get to marrying a score from one of the old school Italian gangster flicks with something that's decidedly Southern. So it still has that Texas rap element because of the bass line and the keys used, but it's the strings that sound like they could have been pulled out of The Godfather or something, and in a generic way, right? But together it makes for this really menacing beat that opens up the album. It's energetic, but it also lets you know, hey, I'm playing off of what I want to get across. The Untouchable being a reference to the whole original Scarface, Al Capone, and that movie about hunting him down. That song doesn't sound like the next song that follows it, nor does it sound like the last song before the Dr. Dre production, nor does it sound like a song later on like Faith, which is this slowed down kind of methodical beat, which has this thump, this slow drawn out thump, reminiscent of Biggie's Warning and how it sampled Isaac Hayes' Walk On By. But this is really just almost a screwed version of I Just Want to Celebrate by Rare Earth. And you don't catch that until you really listen, because they're incorporating like haunting vocal chanting in the background that kind of fleshes the beat out and comes in on the chorus and gives it this ominous feel to go with that methodical ba-doom, doo-doom. In between, you get other beats there that are interpolations like Smile, but for the most part, this album is leaning on original production. So while a lot of the hooks are borrowed from other songs, classic songs, the instrumentation, the actual production is mostly original, including one of the greatest hip-hop beats of all time, Mary Jane, which is piano work at its finest. Sound effects, bass lines, rumbling. It's one of the richest, most lush productions that kind of almost defies hip-hop, and we saw that by what this beat has been sampled for later. It's a genreless kind of production, and that's a testament to that team working together so well. And so that's the kind of production that you're gonna get on here. For every beat, like Sunshine, it just seems like it's gritty, but it has a little bit more upbeat to it. You get something mellow like A Money Makes the World Go Round, where it kind of just creates a sense of calm just because of the melody, how the melody dips in and out. And then of course, Dr. Dre's contribution here is characterized by where he was at in the 90s. This is the Dr. Dre sound that existed somewhere in between his departure from Death Row and his comeback when he dropped Chronic 2001. So it was rich, but you know, a lot of people were wondering about Dre's direction at this point. And so this particular beat, he samples from the movie Into the Dragon. And it's one of the main themes from Into the Dragon. It's probably the most famous part of the Into the Dragon score and soundtrack. And he uses that and adds his signature chimes and Dr. Dre bells and whistles to make it pop. But this was a point in Dre's career where his production sounded very East Coast inspired, and I think he caught a little bit of flack for that. But it fits so well with this album. It's a really energetic ending point where a lot of albums tend to end on slower, more somber and mellow notes. This was a highlight to end the album on, but for some reason that fits so well because Scarface and company were using some of the same kind of instruments. So all these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about the quality of the production, which takes us to Dimension 2, the cohesiveness of that production. So the cohesiveness of the sonic bed. Now, one thing that comes up always when talking about the cohesiveness is how is the album sequenced? This album you'll find has really intuitive moments where you can tell there was some thought behind why one track would follow another track. So we take a song like Southside, where Scarface, does the whole song without a proper hook because it's the shortest track on the album, and he decides to go out with a refrain borrowing from Boogie Down Production, KRS South Bronx, instead saying the South Side, the South Side, and right after that it follows with Sunshine, where his first bar he says "Wa-da-da-dang, wa-da-da-dang-dang," which borrows from another KRS line off the BDP Criminal Minded album 9mm. So moments like that, just like another intuitive moment is the last verse of Smarts. He's talking about the conflict of spirituality versus society and the traps that have been set up racially, and how it's a war of the devil versus God, which takes you right into the next song being Faith, which is all about spirituality and questioning how faith is tested. Another moment to conclude this idea is For Real, where the whole song is about him seeking vengeance on somebody who played him in the drug game, someone who played with his money, someone who came up short, and he's like, oh no, this has got to be handled. Immediately followed by the song Your Money or Your Life, where he's acting that out. He's now enacting and exacting that revenge and handling business, and it's concluded. So it's almost like part 2 to the story, but unofficially. And so there's a lot of those unofficial intuitive moments on the album, but it still doesn't stop it from having what could be considered flaws, because of all those songs I named, the way that they're ordered, if they were changed, you would feel like you're getting the full impact of everything that was done on this album. So you get a fair amount of content, but those first 4 songs are all about murder. And so from Untouchable, No Warning, Southside, and Sunshine, the idea overarching is don't mess with me, I'll come get you. Even though Southside is more this, it starts off as more of this reflective ride through Texas and Scarface's childhood, it comes right back to the present with him ending it by letting you know he's nothing to play with and he's got the gun on him. And so it can start to leave the impression, especially if you are new to Scarface, of, okay, is this what the whole album's gonna be like? You get this small break when Money Makes the World Go Round pops up as track 5. By then you've already been dished out this real vicious message of, I'm a murderer, I'm on these streets, and I'll kill you. Then right after that, it goes right back to it with songs like For Real and Your Money or Your Life. So you don't really start getting into the deeper songs until the end. Now, some people really like that. They like this concept of half and half. Oh, the first half is so gangster and the other side is so deep. But in sequence, you get Mary Jane, you get Smile, you get Smarts, you get Faith. Having your 2 singles right next to each other is also something that people either love or hate, right? It's like, oh, I've heard these a lot. It'd be better if these were fleshed out. Or some people like, these are the only 2 songs I want to play. Cool. Just imagine if it would have been reordered differently. The trade-off is that the melodies and the tones on those deeper songs are often softer and more musical in nature. So even Southside, being that it's not as aggressive as the other songs that are sequenced between, has more of a richer, deep musical quality, like some of those groovy bass lines. And that's what happens on the deeper songs. You're getting more musicality because it's like, oh, these are softer, we want you to hear the message. Unfortunately, the more violent songs are more straightforward in their production, which would be great to have seen 1 for 1, or something a little tougher and upbeat, something a little softer and more mellow, a nice, back and forth between those. But because it is a pretty short album, these aren't takeaways. It just are things that make you wonder how much that resequencing could have affected the cohesiveness. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats takes us to dimension 3, the overall intentional mood and tone. Is there an intentional mood and tone? One, it's Scarface's return. He says that he takes a long time to finalize albums. They're usually worked on for years at a time, so he is fresh off the 95 album, which people consider his other classic in his discography, one of his other classics, The Diary, and then the return of Ghetto Boys in 1996 with the Resurrection album. And so this is him. It's not a comeback, but it's him where he was at that point. And it's not darker than The Diary, but it has a darkness to it. It's more of a don't play with me. He's not really meddling in the macabre or the end of life, and not a lot of death talk, especially not his own. He's talking about the death of you if you mess with him. Always with this message of if provoked, except for the song No Warning. No Warning doesn't come across as if you provoke me, I'll go here. It's more like this is what I do. And so with that feeling, it's this, here's where I am now. I'm still the boss. You still can't get me. Here's what happens to you if you try to get me. But then when you factor in those deeper songs and how deep Scarface is going, this might be some of the deepest reflection of things outside himself that had happened at this point in his career. So songs like Smarts and Faith is really where you start getting this iteration of Scarface that most people have come to know. You know, a lot of people don't know the more ignorant Scarface from when we were reviewing the Ghetto Boys album, or, you know, the more angry Scarface. The mood and tone say it's, I'm back, don't mess with me, I've reached the status of untouchable, and now I want to speak on some other things. If you pick up on any other mood and tone, please let it be known. Put it in the comments, and let's consider that on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, and that takes us to dimension 4, the song distinction versus the repetition of words and sounds. Okay, we talked about the team pulling from this same batch of instrumentation, but it, instead of it sounding redundant or creating a, hey, this track sounded just like this track, it creates this, this all comes back to home base feeling. So again, it centralizes the album, because even on a song like Smile, you're hearing the same kind of modulation that you're hearing on a song like Smarts. And even on the Dr. Dre production, you're hearing the same kind of wet keys that you're gonna hear on Your Money or Your Life. So the repetition factor is very low on the production end, unless you're gonna be a music snob about it and really nitpick. But there's a master level job done of separating the identity and the feel of each song. And a lot of that is because of all the elements together. Sometimes it's the vocals in the background, it's who's singing on the track, it's the way Scarface approaches each song, and you know, some songs even have like DJ scratches. And now, as far as words, it depends on the song. There are songs where Scarface seems to put more effort in unique word choice, and I think that's where he jumps more into his poetic bag, as opposed to songs, more than likely the aggressive songs, where that takes a back seat to the expression and emotion that he wants to get across, the feeling, right? So we take, for instance, the song No Warning. He uses the MF word, which gets thrown around a lot in hip-hop. It's not a word that hip-hop is a stranger to, but this song is 2 minutes and 36 seconds long, and he uses the MF word 13 times. And it's a song that has pretty much no hook, and these tend to come line after line. So it's not like, oh, it's breathable so you forget it and then you hear it later on. It's like, oh, I didn't have another word to finish this sentence, so I'm gonna say it again. So the equivalent, it doesn't have the beautiful language manipulation effect of a Samuel L. Jackson movie, who's become famous for using the MF word to the point where people expect it. It's like, oh, he's gonna say it. Imagine him doing it back to back, and that's what happens on there. So that's a great example of repetition that you wonder why it happens, because you get other songs later on where Scarface doesn't even repeat the same kind of word. So, that's where you'll see it. There's not a lot of repping. He's not repping any crew. He's repping himself. Even when he shouts out Houston, he's shouting out in different ways. He mentions different streets and highways. And that is really the extent. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 5, the content versus the amount of songs. And so this is a 12-song album, 14 tracks if you are looking at the intro and the outro, but altogether 12 songs, which we have determined time and time again on this channel lives within the safe zone. The safe zone, what is that? That is anywhere between 10 to 14 songs where most classics live, because they don't overextend themselves and they don't feel like you got shortchanged with songs. And so out of 12 songs, you get what I mentioned in the sequencing that can seem like there's this redundancy or this limitation, right? But if you were to reshuffle this, you realize that there's about 5 songs that are steeped in heavy content, so much so that this album benefits from a weighted kind of factor, where the depth of what Scarface is talking about on the more topical songs kind of makes up for there being 7 other songs where they're not as focused, because even within those other 7 songs there's textures to it. I mentioned the nuance of Southside, and then you'll hear that on other tracks like For Real and Your Money or Your Life, where they're told in a different way, as opposed to Untouchable and No Warning and Sunshine. So really paying attention, there is enough content to keep this album buoyant, because a song like Mary Jane and a song like Smarts and a song like Faith is so heavy that even lighter topical fare like Smile and Money Makes the World Go Round still gives you food for thought. And that's something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats, content versus the amount of songs. Takes us to dimension 6, the features. Right? We mentioned some of these songs already, might as well talk about who's on them. So, you have legends on this album. You have the legendary Roger Troutman on the first song, doing the hook. Roger Troutman being an artist who historically has been sampled, celebrated, and played mostly on the West Coast, it might make for an interesting point to highlight the interesting fact that most of the features on this album come from West Coast rappers, with the exception of KB and Devin the Dude, who appears twice on here. Everybody on here reps California, and so from Too Short talking on Game Over to Ice Cube doing the hook on Game Over and Dr. Dre providing the beat and going verse for verse with Scarface, to Daz Dillinger showing up on Money Makes the World Go Round, and speaking of legends, famously Tupac on the song Smile. And we also get some vocals on here from Johnny P, who is a Rap-A-Lot staple at this time in the 90s. And also shout out to the background singers, who I can't get all the names for, but if anybody knows the name of all the background singers, because they put their toe in it on songs and hooks like Your Money or Your Life and Sunshine. So why Scarface made this choice is not as easy to highlight or pinpoint as to the ending result. It could have just been the culmination of him gathering features that he had been intending to gather for a while, and they all landed on this album. I know for a fact he pointed out that he begged Dr. Dre for this feature, so this was a feature he was actively working towards. Daz it might have been one of those, hey, I want to work with you things. Tupac, apparently the story is that Tupac ran into Scarface's manager on Sunset Boulevard and they got together and they made the song happen, which originally was slated to be on Tupac's album. You imagine that might be Euthanasia, which turned into the Machiavelli, the 7 Day Theory album, Don Illuminati, but it wound up being used for this, and the quality of the features on here is almost impossible to separate from the quality of the album because they're so a part of what made this album so memorable. It was the burgeoning of Devin the Dude. Scarface really did a lot in bringing Devin's name to the mainstream more than it was before. And especially as a soloist, because Devin prior was a member of the Odd Squad, and Scarface had Devin on albums since previous projects. And it also seems like all of the rappers and singers on this album were able to be their comfortable selves. They didn't go into any different mode because it was a Scarface album. You hear Tupac has 2 verses on Smile. You can tell it was intended to be his song, but even his talking in the middle is memorable. I always know that the standout for me as a fan listening to this song was when, Tupac is like, you ain't got nothing to worry about. You black, smile for me now. Those touches add to someone's presence. When we were talking about the Migos album, how they just had their guests come and just do a verse, there were no talking, ad-libs, or hook involvement. And so they just showed up. And here, it didn't seem like the guest showed up. Even though Too Short just does a little talking part, it might have been cool if he talked at the end too to round it out. Getting 2 full verses from Dre going back and forth, I don't know who wrote his verses, but it made for this contrast. And that's what you want out of collabs, the contrast. Scarface's voice and tone, his content compared to what Dre is doing and the status that they have. A lot of people consider Dre and Scarface to be equal status in the game. They were both gangster rap pioneers and both broke doors down for their regions. And, along the way, their music has done some damage, but, standing there, that's a giant collaboration. To have Ice Cube just doing the hook, who at this point, if you remember the West Side Connection review, Ice Cube was hook master at this point. So they made the right choice. Devin, another hook master. Devin's decision to do his sing rap thing early in the game on his verse on Money Makes the World Go Round. Daz is calm. These are just things you can't take back. Johnny P singing his heart out on Smile and ending it powerfully. All these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to dimension 7. The question of how weak is the weakest song, and do the weakest songs bring the album down? Always subjective, always up to you to determine. I think if we are to take what I mentioned about the song No Warning, how short it is, and how much of a backseat to lyricism Scarface seemed to take, it almost sounded like a freestyle. It almost seemed very phoned and dialed in, like he didn't really think about what he was gonna say. He just wanted to show aggression on there. There's some people, they love that, but if we're talking about technicality in rap, that would come off as perhaps the weakest song. If you don't like songs with singing or songs where the hook is borrowed from another, then you're not gonna like Sunshine or Faith or Smile because it borrows from the SOS band, Tell Me If You Still Care, and things like that. Or if you think those beats are just too soft. I do think No Warning is probably the least imaginative production on there as well. It's just this kind of stripped down beat with a bass line and some drums. It doesn't have much going on, so that also factors into it feeling like maybe it's one of the less effort-based songs. The production was executed in a way where they go to those softer tones, it doesn't seem like, oh, this is the soft song, this is the radio song. So all those things are for you to factor in when you're determining if there's a weak song on this album and how much it brings the album down. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to dimension 8, Mass Appeal. Mass Appeal, we're talking about a Texas legend doing things that are decidedly Southern, basing most of his rap career on his allegiance to an independent Black-owned label, Rap-A-Lot Records. And for a while, it seemed like there was a lack of concern about whether other markets would pick things up that he came out with. I read him saying that he felt like when he dropped I Seen a Man Die or Never Seen a Man Cry, depending on which version you saw, that's when he felt like New York locked in and he got on their radar. So that means he was tapping other markets, where the South and the West Coast even had Scarface on the top of lists for a while at that point. And so going into this album, could you tell from the songs that there was any push to really move more units or tap into more markets? It's not evident. Scarface said when he made Smile, he wasn't intending for it to be this big hit, but they knew that they had something on their hands when they were planning to release this album shortly after Pac passed. And so this song wound up being Scarface's only gold single and helped push this to be Scarface's #1 charting Billboard album, which stayed at the top of those charts for a few weeks. So one of his most memorable albums with his biggest single to date. And then Mary Jane being something that Scarface said, they made while they were high on ecstasy, even though the song is about marijuana, it just became this sleeper hit, which real music heads, real rap heads love and know. And I'm sure it got played in regular rotation in Houston. Didn't quite make it to the northern market radio-wise. So after Smile, Scarface's presence in New York might have died down, but that video, I was always checking for that video. That video got major play. Game Over never got the video treatment that it deserved. I remember it being put up on Battle of the Beats on New York radio against something, and people were still deep in their East Coast versus West Coast minds, so they had just assumed, Scarface was siding with the West Coast. And that's a fair conclusion to come to if you're looking at the track list on this album, who's on it, and some of the sounds. It seemed like Scarface was leaning in that direction. Who could blame him? Texas is technically southwest of the continent. So I don't think Scarface was explicitly declaring any allegiance. I just think this is how it wound up being. But at the time, you could see that maybe contributing to a divisive split on who's running to get this album and who wasn't. So videos did a lot. Smile is still probably one of the most visually appealing, artistically shot, color savvy videos of all time for any genre. Scarface has historically been a pretty out-the-box thinker and really involved in his creative processes, whether he was sober or not. He speaks about being under the influence of drugs during this period heavily. So all these things added to this being probably his most recognizable, most successful album, something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to my favorite dimension 9, the 3 I's: impact, innovation, influence. All right, what comes of this album? The impact when it was released was one of the biggest that Scarface had ever had, and a lot of that has to be attributed to the hype around knowing that this Tupac feature was going to be on this album and the video coming out as the first official single, and people speculating over whether or not Tupac was dead or alive because there's Tupac in this video. Now, there's been all kinds of legend and myth around it. They said it was an actor who looked like Tupac. If so, props to that man and that director, because they shot that in a way where it definitely looked like Tupac rapping. They captured his essence to a T. They used the shadows and the lighting perfectly. And if not, there's also been conflicting reports that this was the last video that Tupac shot around the same time as I Ain't Mad at Ya. Either story you want to believe is believable. If somebody has the facts, please leave them down in the comments. I'd love to know and hear it from someone who was there, and that'd be great. If anybody has a quote. If that's still speculated now, you can imagine the height of speculation at a time where social media didn't exist and people were just talking word of mouth. Is that Pac? Is he alive? how beautiful the video is, how deep it was. Scarface then goes and adds a nod to Biggie on the video version and the single version that was re-released, because by that point Biggie had passed. This album dropped in March 11 of 1997. Biggie had just passed away. So when this video came, it was like, whoa, what's going on? It added to the depth and gravitas of that whole song, and the imagery really took it home and made this feel like so much, because we're tapping into spiritual visual, spiritual ideas. Just that alone carried it, and it kind of sucks to think that someone else's presence on your album tipped your album to be more successful than it may have been. But then we look at a song like Mary Jane and the impact that that left on the game for years and decades to come, really, because by the time Murder Inc., who were huge fans of Rap A Lot, going so far as to borrow some of their producers later on, like Seven Aurelius, who originated from the Rap A Lot camp in the 2000s, to helm their sound and create that Murder Inc. sound that so many people loved and quickly got tired of. It says a lot. So you could tell Irv Gotti was tuned in and tapped not only this song, but a later song from Scarface for another Ashanti album. But for her debut, they sampled Mary Jane and created the hit, the smash hit Baby, which became so widely known and such a mega hit that there are folks living out there, more folks familiar with Ashanti song, who have no clue that this came from Scarface. People would immediately probably start singing Ashanti once the notes creep in, until they hear Scarface's words come in for the first verse. Got this love forming in my life, right? What an impact. What an impact. And other songs off this album live that same way. People really like the song For Real, Your Money or Your Life, and Southside is one of those sleeper hits, B-side street singles. And from this, if we're talking about influence, a lot of Southern rappers look back in Scarface's discography when we're hearing these conversations about Scarface being top 10 dead or alive, or #1 on the Southern rapper list, or top 5. These album moments, or this album, factors heavily into why people say that, because this was a huge part of people's upbringing, creating a 90s soundscape for hip-hop, especially at a really interesting time like the East Coast and West Coast, bringing this Southern prominence. All of that is something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to the final dimension, dimension 10, the overall timelessness and uniqueness. I think we've hinted at this in different ways in each dimension so far. There's only a few beats on here that sound like that 90s feel. I pointed Mary Jane again, the fact that it had life in the 2000s and has now become one of those cemented hits that if you play it at any point, the Ashanti version, women somewhere will be singing it, people somewhere will be singing it. It's just lush. Southside hits like that. Smile is another one of those records. All those musical elements that are brought into it. This Texas sound from the Texas Pioneers with his team, who have pretty much created the Texas sound next to Pimp C from UGK. What can you say? I mean, it's of course gonna feel unique because there's nothing sounding like it. If there were other Southern rap albums that were using similar instrumentation, it wasn't with this kind of core solidness and level of musicality that was coming from this team. And then you add the lyricism and the depth of what those deeper songs were introducing and who Scarface was becoming. You now have this album that I think definitely stands out and can live past its era. But of course, that's always up to you. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And with that, that concludes our Category 1 review of the classic album turning 25 this year, The Untouchable by Scarface. And so catch us for Category 2 on the next episode, where we go into the rap performance on this album, and y'all know how it goes. Until then, F a Rap Critic. They talk about it while I live it. Word to meth.